Imagine being ordered to build one of the largest stone structures on Earth. No cranes, no engines, no laser levels, no modern surveying equipment. Now make it weigh roughly 6 million tons, build it from millions of stone blocks, and somehow make the finished structure so precise that people are still arguing about how it was possible more than 4,000 years later. So the real question isn't whether the Great Pyramid is impressive. It's whether humans at the time could actually have built it on their own. That question becomes even stranger when you look beyond Egypt. The Maya, on the other side of the world, also built enormous pyramid-shaped monuments. That similarity has led some people to wonder whether the two civilizations were somehow connected, but there is no evidence that ancient Egypt and the Maya were ever in contact. So instead of chasing a connection we can't prove, let's focus on the structure at the center of the mystery, the Great Pyramid of Giza. It was built more than 4,000 years ago, yet its orientation is remarkably close to true north. And that creates an immediate problem. How do you align something that enormous so accurately without modern surveying tools? Ancient records don't tell us exactly how it was done. One possibility is that Egyptian builders used the stars. Another hypothesis involves something much simpler, a plumb bob. By combining a basic tool like that with observations of the stars, builders may have been able to establish a very accurate direction, which is already an important clue. Something that looks impossibly advanced does not always require an impossibly advanced tool. But then the theories get much stranger. One famous claim involves the number 43,200. According to the theory, relationships between the pyramid's height and perimeter can be compared, using that ratio, with the Earth's radius and circumference. Other claims go even further, linking pyramid measurements to things such as the mass of the sun, the speed of light, and the moon's orbital velocity. If those relationships were deliberately built into the pyramid, then the obvious question is, how could the Egyptians have known any of that? Some people see an encoded message. Others go further and suggest knowledge from a non-human source. But there's a problem. With enough measurements and enough numbers, patterns can start appearing almost anywhere. Skeptics argue that this is exactly what happens with numerology. Keep comparing values long enough, and eventually, some of them will seem meaningful. So, before the pyramid can be treated as an ancient scientific code, you first have to prove those relationships were intentional, and that has never been settled. So let's leave the hidden numbers behind and move to a much more physical question. How do you actually build the thing? The mainstream view is that construction took roughly 20 years and was completed around 2560 BC, and the pyramid people saw then would have looked very different from the one standing today. Its exterior was originally covered in smooth, polished limestone, giving it the appearance of a huge artificial mountain rather than the rough, exposed blocks we see now. It stood about 481 feet tall, with a base more than 750 feet across. It weighed around 5.9 million tons, and it contained roughly 2.3 million stone blocks. Spread across about 20 years, that works out to roughly 12 blocks being placed every hour if construction continued around the clock. Now, the mystery has changed. This is no longer just about precision. It is about logistics. For a long time, the popular image was that around 100,000 people built the pyramid, many of them slaves. But the picture presented today is very different. A figure closer to about 20,000 workers has been suggested, operating more like a huge organized workforce than a giant mass of slave labor. There were laborers, engineers, managers, and support workers. There was even a large operation dedicated to feeding them, and some surviving records make these workers sound surprisingly ordinary. People took time off because they had fought with their wife or because they needed to work on their own house. Apparently, even while building a wonder of the ancient world, people still had problems at home. But having an organized workforce only solves one part of the puzzle. Those workers still had to move the stones. Imagine being given that job with basic tools such as pickaxes and chisels and almost no machinery. Some of the largest stones could weigh up to 80 tons. An adult African elephant weighs roughly 7 tons. So moving one of those blocks would be like trying to drag about 11 elephants at once. And some of the stone is said to have come from quarries more than 500 miles away. After all that transportation, the blocks still had to be positioned with extreme precision. At this point, the job starts sounding impossible again. But the solution may have been much simpler than the problem. There is evidence that the Egyptians used organized methods to work out how stones should be transported and placed, though the exact details of that method are not known. For movement across land, one important tool may have been a sled. Put the stone on the sled, attach ropes, pull, but now you have another problem: dry sand. Dragging enormous weight across it creates resistance. So instead of inventing a more complicated machine, the Egyptians may have changed the surface itself. They added water. A wall painting appears to show workers pulling a heavy load on a sled while another person pours water in front of it. That small change could make the sled easier to move across the sand. No mysterious machine, just a smarter way to use the ground beneath it. But moving a stone horizontally is only half the job. It still has to reach the construction site and then go upward. So the process appears to have been a chain of simpler solutions. First, the stone was mined and shaped at the quarry. Then it could be transported by boat and dragged across land using sleds and ropes. For the vertical problem, a ramp system is generally thought to have been involved with grease or animal fat, possibly making the route easier to pull across. Ropes then helped move the blocks upward. That is the important shift. You do not need one miraculous machine that explains the entire pyramid. You need a series of ordinary methods working together inside an enormous organized project. And once you look at it that way, the Great Pyramid stops looking physically impossible. It still looks brutally difficult. But difficult and impossible are not the same thing. That does not mean every mystery has been solved. We still do not know the exact method used to achieve the pyramid's alignment with true north. We also do not know every detail of the construction process. And the debate over supposed codes in the pyramid's dimensions has never completely disappeared. But missing information is not evidence for aliens. It may simply mean that ancient Egyptians were more capable than we sometimes assume, whether through tools we have not yet discovered or a stronger practical understanding of mathematics and astronomy. There is one final possibility that sometimes enters the discussion. What if the Egyptians were not helped by aliens, but were somehow influenced by an even earlier advanced civilization? That idea touches on the Silurian hypothesis, which asks whether an industrial civilization that existed millions of years ago would even leave evidence we could recognize today. It is an interesting question, but it is not evidence that such a civilization actually existed. The researchers behind the idea strongly doubted that an earlier industrial civilization had ever existed at all. The hypothesis explores what traces one might leave, not whether one has been discovered. And that brings us back to the explanation we can actually support. There are still unanswered questions about the Great Pyramid, but nothing here requires aliens to make its construction possible. What we are left with is something impressive enough on its own: an enormous organized workforce, simple tools used intelligently, and a staggering amount of human effort. Maybe that is the real reason the Great Pyramid still feels impossible, not because humans could not have built it, but because humans did something so difficult that thousands of years later, it still looks like they shouldn't have been able to.